In the spring of 1878, two railroad companies sent armed men into a canyon in southern Colorado, so narrow that sunlight touched the river below for only a few hours each day. The walls of the Royal Gorge rose more than 1,000 feet on either side, sheer granite plunging vertically into the Arkansas River, leaving no flat ground wide enough for a roadbed, let alone a railroad. But beyond that gorge lay the silver camps of Leadville, and whoever could thread a line of steel through the chasm would control the richest mining boom in the American West. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had the legal right to the route. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe had gotten there first. What followed was a 2-year conflict fought with drills and dynamite in the canyon, with rifles and hired gunfighters along the rail lines, and with attorneys in federal courtrooms all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But beneath the corporate war lay a deeper, older story. The story of the men who actually built the railroad, laboring inside a granite throat that tried to swallow them, and the engineering solution so audacious that it has carried trains for nearly 150 years. The physical problem was simple to state and nearly impossible to solve. The Royal Gorge is a 6-mile cut through a high plateau of Precambrian granite, carved over millions of years by the Arkansas River as it drained the Rocky Mountains. In most of its length, the gorge is wide enough at its base for a river, a road, and perhaps a single railroad line squeezed onto a bench of flat rock above the waterline. But at its narrowest point, roughly halfway through, the canyon constricts to a throat barely 30 feet wide. The river fills nearly all of it. The walls do not slope or stair-step downward. They drop, perpendicular and smooth, from a height of over 2,600 feet, directly into the water. There is no ledge. There is no bank. There is no surface on which to lay a tie, let alone a rail. Every engineer who looked at it reached the same conclusion. You could not blast a shelf into the wall because the granite was too hard and the river too close. You could not fill the canyon floor because the river would wash the fill away during spring runoff when snowmelt turned the Arkansas into a roaring torrent capable of moving boulders the size of boxcars. And you could not go around because the gorge was the only route to Leadville that did not require climbing passes above 10,000 feet, passes that would trap locomotives in winter snow for months at a time. The gorge was the door, and the door was barely wide enough for the river alone. But here is what made the matter urgent. In 1877, prospectors working the hills near a rough mining camp called Oro City, later renamed Leadville, struck rich veins of silver and lead carbonate ore. By 1878, word had spread. By 1879, the boom was on. Miners poured into the district by the thousands. The ore they pulled from the ground was extraordinarily valuable, but it was useless without transportation. Every pound of ore had to move out of the mountains by mule train or wagon, along trails that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter, at costs that ate the profits raw. The railroad that reached Leadville first would carry the ore, the miners, the equipment, the provisions, and the wealth of an entire mining district. The railroad that arrived second would carry nothing. There were only two serious contenders, the Denver and Rio Grande, founded by William Jackson Palmer, a former Union Army general and railroad visionary, held a congressional grant from 1870, giving it the right-of-way along the Arkansas River. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, a larger and better-financed railroad pushing west from Kansas, had no such grant, but it had something Palmer's company lacked: cash, and the willingness to spend it aggressively. The two had already clashed once, in February of 1878, at Raton Pass on the Colorado-New Mexico border, where Santa Fe crews laid track over the most difficult section of the pass hours before Palmer's men arrived. There were shoving matches, threats, no sustained gunfire. Palmer's men withdrew. The Santa Fe claimed the pass, but Leadville changed everything. The Royal Gorge was the only route, and it could hold only one railroad. On April 19, 1878, the Santa Fe rushed a hastily assembled grading crew to the mouth of the gorge near Canyon City and began cutting a roadbed. The Denver and Rio Grande, arriving from the other direction, found their path blocked by a matter of hours. They had lost the first move in a contest that would last 2 years. What followed was not a construction project, it was a siege. Both railroads hired armed guards to protect their grading crews. Rifles and pistols lay beside picks and shovels. At night, men from one company would cross the canyon floor and dynamite the other's work, roll boulders onto freshly graded roadbed, throw tools and rails into the river. The Santa Fe hired Bat Masterson, the sheriff of Dodge City, to recruit a private army of gunfighters, men whose names already carried the weight of Western legend. Doc Holliday came with him, so did Dirty Dave Rudebour, Ben Thompson, and Mysterious Dave Mather. Roughly 70 armed men arrived in Colorado on a special train in late March of 1879, ready to fight their way into the gorge by force. But the real soldiers in this war were not the gunfighters. They were the graders, the drillers, the powder men, the mule skinners, and the bridge carpenters who worked inside the canyon every day, hanging off ropes above the river, drilling holes into granite by hand, setting black powder charges, and clearing rubble in wheelbarrows along a path so narrow that 2 men could not pass each other without one stepping into the current. The labor force that built the Royal Gorge line was not well documented. The names of the men who drilled and blasted were not recorded in the corporate histories. They were, in all likelihood, a mix of Irish and Chinese immigrant laborers, local Colorado miners between claims, and itinerant track workers who followed the railroads west, men who had already built lines across the plains of Kansas and the deserts of New Mexico, and who now found themselves inside a granite canyon where the work was harder, the footing less certain, and the danger more immediate than anything they had encountered before. Consider what it meant to build a roadbed inside the Royal Gorge in 1878. The canyon floor was either river or vertical rock. Where a narrow bench of stone existed above the waterline, men had to widen it by hand, drilling holes into the cliff face with star drills and 4-pound sledgehammers, filling the holes with black powder, lighting fuses, and retreating down the canyon before the blast threw jagged granite into the air and the river. Then they returned. They cleared the broken rock, they drilled again, they blasted again. Foot by foot, they carved a shelf wide enough for ties and rails out of living granite, with the river roaring below them and the canyon wall rising above them so high that the sky at midday was a strip of blue no wider than a man's hand. The spring runoff made it worse. In May and June, snowmelt from the mountains above swelled the Arkansas River until it rose feet in a single day, scouring the canyon floor with a force that could tear a roadbed apart and carry the wreckage downstream. Men who had spent weeks cutting a shelf into the rock would watch the river take it in an afternoon. Then they would go back. They would start again, higher up the wall, drilling into harder stone, rebuilding what the water had destroyed, and the gunfighters added another layer of danger. A man drilling a star drill into the canyon wall might look up and see armed riders at the rim above, or hear rifle shots echoing off the granite from a rival crew a quarter-mile down the gorge. The work was hard enough without the fear that someone might roll a boulder onto you from 1,000 feet above, or dynamite your section of roadbed while you were still standing on it. Both companies built stone forts inside the gorge to protect their crews. The remnants of these, rough walls of stacked granite, chest-high, built by men who were engineers and laborers 1 hour and infantrymen the next, are still visible today. They are among the few physical traces of the human labor that went into this railroad. Everything else, the tools, the powder kegs, the temporary trestles, the camps, was either washed away by the river or swallowed back into the canyon. The legal war ran parallel to the physical one. Both railroads filed suit. Both sought injunctions. The case climbed through the Colorado courts and into the federal system, all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which on April 21, 1879, granted the Denver and Rio Grande the primary right-of-way through the gorge. It was a victory that should have settled everything. It settled nothing. The Santa Fe refused to leave. Masterson and his gunfighters returned to Colorado in June, taking positions at Cuchara, Trinidad, Colorado Springs, and inside the railroad roundhouse at Pueblo, where 50 armed men held out against an encircling force of DNRG men. On the morning of June 11, 1879, the Denver and Rio Grande attacked on multiple fronts. 2 men were reportedly killed at Cuchara. Sharp fighting broke out at Colorado Springs. The standoff at the Pueblo roundhouse ended not with a gun battle, but with a single unarmed man, R.F. Whitebreck, an officer of the DNRG, walking up to the building, showing Masterson a court order and asking him to leave. Masterson looked at the order. He looked at the men surrounding him. He and his men, including Doc Holliday, were back in Dodge City by June 13th, but the Santa Fe was not finished. In July, a court order temporarily returned the line to the Santa Fe. Palmer complied, without violence, but vowed to keep fighting. The legal wrangling continued for another year, through the Colorado Supreme Court and back, until finally, on March 27, 1880, the 2 railroads signed what newspapers called the Treaty of Boston. The DNRG would keep the Royal Gorge. The Santa Fe would receive $1.8 million for the track and grading it had already completed inside the canyon. The war was over, but the railroad was not yet built. The legal battle and the armed conflict had consumed nearly 2 years. 2 years during which the silver boom in Leadville was raging without a rail line. 2 years during which the ore moved out by mule and wagon at ruinous cost. The company that had won the gorge had won it late, and the hardest engineering problem still lay unsolved at the narrowest point, where the canyon was 30 feet wide and the river filled all of it. The man who solved it was Charles Shaler Smith, a civil engineer who had already built railroads across difficult terrain in the American South and Midwest. Smith looked at the narrows and reached a conclusion that no one before him had dared to act on. If there was no ground for the railroad would have to hang. His design was structurally elegant and physically terrifying, a 175-foot plate girder, a single span of riveted iron, would carry the track across the narrows. One end of the girder would rest on a shelf of natural rock on the canyon wall. The other end, where no rock shelf existed, would be suspended from a set of massive iron A-frame brackets. These brackets would span the river, bolted and anchored directly into the granite walls on both sides, their arms reaching out over the water like the bones of a bridge that had been cut in half. The track would cross the gorge not on solid ground but on iron, suspended above a river that could rise 10 feet in a spring flood, inside a canyon where the walls climbed 2,600 feet above the rails. Construction of the hanging bridge, as it came to be called, began in 1878, and was completed in 1879 at a cost of $11,759. The figure is almost absurdly small. $11,000 for a structure that would carry the full weight of steam locomotives and loaded freight cars across a gap where no roadbed could exist, in a canyon that had already defeated every engineer who looked at it. The bridge was not a suspension bridge in the modern sense. It was a girder bridge held in the air by brackets rooted in granite, a hybrid form, half cantilever and half suspension, built from wrought iron and steel plate, in an era when the science of metallurgy was still young, and the behavior of iron under repeated load was not fully understood. The workers who built it drilled anchor holes into the canyon walls by hand, suspended over the river on ropes and planks, setting iron bolts into granite with the same star drills and sledgehammers they had used to carve the roadbed. They hoisted the plate girder into position using derricks and block and tackle, wrestling a span of riveted iron into a canyon so narrow that the crane arms could barely extend. Every piece of the bridge, every bracket, every bolt, every plate had to be brought into the gorge on the very roadbed that the bridge was being built to complete. The last section of rail leading to the bridge was laid while the bridge was still being assembled. The railroad built itself into the narrows one rail length at a time, and the hanging bridge was the final piece that closed the gap. On July 20th, 1880, the first train from Canyon City reached Leadville. Among the passengers was former President Ulysses S. Grant. The railroad was complete, the ore could now move, the silver that had been trapped in the mountains for 3 years could finally flow down the Arkansas River Valley to the smelters in Pueblo and Denver, and from there to the mints and markets of the east. The Denver and Rio Grande had won the gorge, built the line, and opened Leadville to the world. But the victory was bittersweet. The 2 years lost to the Royal Gorge War had cost the company millions in legal fees, construction delays, and the $1.8 million payment to the Santa Fe. The silver boom in Leadville peaked early and began to decline by the mid-1880s as the richest surface deposits were worked out. The railroad arrived in time to carry the boom, but it missed the steepest part of the curve. And the cost in human life, both from the armed conflict and from the construction itself, was never fully counted. The number of workers killed or injured inside the gorge during the blasting, the drilling, and the bridge construction is unknown. The number of men killed in the armed clashes is disputed. 2 deaths at Kuchara are reported in some sources and denied in others. The corporate records do not mention them. The newspapers of the time treated the war as a spectacle, a story of rival barons and hired guns, not as a record of the men who built the thing. The gorge itself was not kind to what was built inside it. On August 31st, 1896, a flood surged through the Royal Gorge that tore the track apart, washed out sections of roadbed, and tested the hanging bridge to its limits. The bridge held. The anchors driven into the granite walls held. The roadbed was rebuilt within days, and the trains ran again. The flood proved what the engineers and the workers had built. Not a fragile structure, but something rooted into the bones of the mountain itself. What changed because of the Royal Gorge Railroad was not just Leadville. The completion of the line through the gorge gave the Denver and Rio Grande a route to the western slope of the Rockies. By 1881, Palmer's crews had pushed the line over Marshall Pass and into Gunnison, making the D&RG the first railroad to reach the western side of the Colorado Mountains. The Royal Gorge was not just a route to a silver camp. It was the first breach in the wall of the Rockies, the crack through which a regional railroad became a trans-mountain system, connecting the Front Range to the mining districts of the western slope and eventually to the salt flats of Utah. The narrow-gauge line that Palmer built through the gorge was the spine of a network that shaped the settlement, the economy, and the political geography of Colorado for the next half-century. And the hanging bridge, the impossible structure, the iron span suspended over a river inside a canyon, became one of the most photographed engineering landmarks in the American West. Trains would stop on the bridge so that passengers could step down onto the narrow platform and look up at the granite walls rising above them. Theodore Roosevelt picnicked there in 1905, standing on the bridge with his entourage, eating lunch above the river in a place where no flat ground existed. The Chicago White Sox posed for a team photograph on the bridge in 1910, on their way to spring training. The hanging bridge was not just a piece of infrastructure, it was a destination, a symbol of what human engineering could do when the terrain offered nothing but a wall and a river. Today, the railroad through the Royal Gorge is still in operation. The Royal Gorge Route Railroad runs excursion trains through the canyon from Canyon City, carrying passengers along the same roadbed that was blasted out of the granite by hand in 1878 and 1879. The track has been rebuilt and relaid many times. The original iron of the hanging bridge has been strengthened and reinforced to carry the heavier loads of modern rail equipment. But the structure is the same. The anchors are in the same holes, drilled into the same granite walls by men whose names no one recorded. The A-frame brackets still reach out over the river. The track still hangs. If you ride the train today, you can see the stone forts the workers built, rough walls of stacked granite, chest high, half hidden among the boulders at the canyon floor. the last visible trace of the armed camps where graders slept with rifles beside their blankets. You can see the drill marks in the canyon walls where star drills punched holes into the rock, one blow at a time, 4 pounds of sledgehammer at a stroke. You can see the hanging bridge, and if you lean toward the window as the train crosses it, you can look down at the Arkansas River below the rails and understand, in your body rather than in words, what it means to build a railroad where the ground does not exist. The walls of the Royal Gorge are the same walls the workers faced. The river is the same river, the granite is the same granite. The only thing that has changed is that the men who drilled it, blasted it and hung the iron over it are gone, and no one remembers their names. The corporate war is remembered because it had famous participants, generals and gunfighters and presidents. The engineering is remembered because it produced a structure that still stands. But the labor, the physical, bodily, dangerous, repetitive labor of men who stood on ropes above a river and swung sledgehammers into granite until the canyon gave them a road, that labor has no monument. It has no plaque, it has no name. The modern world still rests on that labor. The ore that built the American industrial economy in the late 19th century moved through this gorge. The railroad network that connected the Rocky Mountain West to the rest of the country was opened by this line. And the bridge that carries trains through the Narrows today, 147 years after it was built, is held in the air by anchors set by men who were paid by the day, whose names were never written down, and whose work outlasted every corporation, every lawsuit, and every gunfighter who fought over the ground they built it on.